conversation. And thank you for spending this beautiful Friday morning with us. The geopolitical crisis at the heart of the Middle East right now is speaking directly and really urgently to a question that often goes unnoticed: food security. And this is an issue that MEI has been tracking closely, and one that we intend to keep drawing attention to because the stakes demand it. The conflict in Iran, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and the collapse of fertilizer supply chains could all translate into hunger, into instability, and human suffering for millions of people who rarely make it to the front pages. And we convene today's event because we collectively need to pay closer attention. And today's panels feature a range of experts who have been focused on exactly that, an exceptional group of people who understand these stakes better than anybody else. And among them, it is my great honor to introduce a man who has dedicated his life to this effort, Governor David Beasley, a great humanitarian and the former executive director of the World Food Program, Nobel Prize laureate, and one of the most powerful voices on global food security in the world. Over to you.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. And it's just heartbreaking to see what's happening. So everyone, thank you for being here. NCSR, the Middle East Institute, for organizing this extremely timely conversation. And the fact that you're bringing together policymakers and researchers and the private sector into the same room is exactly what this moment demands at a time like this. And because what we're talking about today is not just a one-off issue. Food security, as you know, touches not just hundreds of millions of people, billions of people all over the world. And I've spent, all of you know, I've spent years traveling around the world, refugee camps, war zones, capitals. And the one thing I can tell you with absolute certainty is this: when the food supply breaks down, everything else breaks down. You don't just get hungry people, you get instability, you get migration, you get the conditions that extremists exploit and take advantage of. And we know what happens. And for every 1% increase in hunger, there's a 2% increase in migration. I've seen it. It's not just a statistic to me. And that's a pattern I've watched out play all over the world, from Yemen to Syria, the Sahel, over and over and over again. So let's talk about what's happening literally right now. And I want to get, as you know, I've got a reputation when I speak to the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, or the United Nations Security Council. I pretty much tell it like it is, and that's what's expected of me, and that's what I want to get to today, because this conflict with Iran, it's a war of choice, and as of today, I have not seen or heard a justification that makes sense of why we're there. I just don't see how this serves the interests of the American people. And I'm looking forward to hearing it, but I'm not hearing it yet. And I say that as someone who has spent my entire life in public service, who believes in the power deeply of American leadership and what we've done and the good that we've done around the world, who've seen firsthand what happens when ordinary people, children and mothers and farmers, and when powerful nations make decisions that send shockwaves through the global food systems. And I've seen what happens when America leads right. It's not just that children live and families have a better way of life, but it stabilizes populations and it brings hope to people all over the world. And this is not just a military or geopolitical story, it's a food story. And it's playing out in a world that is already stretched dangerously thin. When I joined WFP in 2017, I began talking about the perfect storm. We had conflict, climate shocks, COVID. Then Ukraine was hit by Russia. The breadbasket of the world Ukraine was. It grew enough food to feed 400 million people. You think it just can't get any worse. And then you have what we're facing now, the war in Iran, the Strait of Hormuz. So understand this also. This is the fifth mega food crisis in just 20 years. The 2008 financial crisis, the Arab Spring in 2011, COVID 2020, Russia 2022, and now 2026, the Iran conflict. The compounding dynamic impact on the poorest of the poor is just absolutely unbearable. So let me kind of put this in practical plain terms of this crisis. As many of you participate know that a significant portion of the world's fertilizer supply moves through or is tied to this region that we are talking about. Iran and the broader Gulf are not just energy exporters, they are critical nodes in the global fertilizer supply chain. We're talking about
Governor,
ammonia, urea.
Governor, can you hit your camera back on? We just didn't have your video real quick.
Okay, I I don't know how much I got lost with there. This I'm in a room in Frankfurt Airport, trying to make this work. So don't hesitate to stop me again and when I'm on this roll talking about what's so important. So anyway, let me put it kind of in the practical terms about the phosphates and the urea
Oh,
and the
your video
ammonia.
went off
Uh,
again.
these aren't just luxury goods. These are the inputs of which farmers from Bangladesh to Burkina Faso and on, they can't produce the food that they need. And already they're struggling in many of these places of affordability, access, and it's dynamically and devastating the places that
Governor,
we're
the
talking
camera
about.
went off again.
Interrupt him. His-
All right. All right. Let me just get right to it. So here we are. Devastation taking place all over this region. And I want to say this very practically because I know men and women in Washington mean well. But when you look at where we are, because I hear people say, well, we can't afford aid and any more aid. And I used to hear this in Bavaria. I used to hear it in Canada. I used to hear it in London. I hear it in the United States. And well, why should I send money to Guatemala or starving people in the Sahel when we're struggling right here at home to fund infrastructure, healthcare, education? And I would say, look, if you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart of loving your neighbor, you better do it out of your financial and your national security interests. And let me explain very clearly, because this is not hypothetical, this is reality. When we fund strategically and effectively, it's not that just lives are saved. We're talking about stabilization of populations. And I'll just give you a real simple example. And this is anecdotal, not hypothetical. It applies to the U.S., but this number right here, when Europeans and Americans, for example, didn't address the root cause in Syria, and you had just 1 million refugees in Syria over a 5-year period, that was $125 billion, $70 or 70 euros a day. The World Food Program, we can feed a Syrian in Syria for 50 cents a day. So do the math. Because you didn't address root cause and provide resilience and sustainability, if you'd have done it right, you would have freed up $70 versus 50 cents. That's 140 times. So divide 125 billion by 140. You would have freed up $124 billion for healthcare, education, and infrastructure. And on top of that, you destabilize the populations and created havoc. And by the way, I've met and probably talked to more refugees than about anybody on the planet. I hadn't met one yet that wanted to leave home. People don't want to leave home. People are the same all over the world. In fact, well, at the World Food Program, we were feeding, when I left, about 160 million people on any given day, week, or month. When you feed that many people, we survey people a lot. And, if I fed everybody in this room every day for a couple of years, I know what's going on in your neighborhood. We know what's happening. And so when we poll or survey people, like Mr. Beasley, we don't want to leave home. They'll move 2, 3, 4, 5 times before they will leave their home country. But if they don't have food security, they go do what any mom and dad in the whole world would do. They go find it. And it's their last resort that they do. And so why don't we do it right? And this war, the impact that it's having on the fertilizer, access to it, the cost, and it's not just fuel. And the farmers and the smallholder farmers around the world, particularly those that are so vulnerable to groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda in the Sahel. I can remember many mothers telling me, Mr. Beasley, my daughter, my son, my husband didn't want to join ISIS or Al Qaeda, but we hadn't fed our family in 2 weeks. What were we supposed to do? Or you might hear the story from a woman in Deir ez-Zor saying, I had to make a decision either buy cooking oil or heating oil. I couldn't buy both. I either have to freeze my child to death or starve my child to death. This is what we're talking about. And when I hear somebody say the cutbacks, it's one thing to cut ineffective, non-strategic foreign aid. It's another thing to cut strategic, effective international foreign aid. I've seen firsthand what happens when aid is strategic and effective. Yes, it saves lives, stabilizes populations. And I've seen what happens when it's not there. Children die, nations destabilize. And when you compound with the fact that the United States is cutting back foreign aid that stabilizes populations, which is going to cost the American taxpayer billions and billions of dollars, but also the Europeans, they're not stepping up. They're cutting back as we speak because of the pressure upon them with regards to increase in NATO funding. They're already taxed to the max. And so it's a compounding effect that's taking place on many nations around the world, and we will pay a price. I call it hell on earth. It's just going to be catastrophic. And so what are we going to do about it? We've got to be focused, and this is why I'm hoping that the policymakers, think tanks, all of you in this room will understand the things that we must do and must do immediately. Address long-term sustainability, not just short-term reactionary. And you've heard me already talk about this when we don't address long-term stability. I used to, I guess, I don't have the fun at the expense of my Democrat, Republican friends in the Senate and the House. And, you know, there are many good D's and R's. And I'm a little disappointed with both parties right now, but that's a whole nother story, you know. So I would say, you know, it's like you've got leaking water lines in the ceiling up there, and it's going to cost you $1,000 to go up there and fix it. But no, you want to fight over where to put the buckets because you're so obsessed with hating each other right now. And so 6 months from now, it's not $1,000 fix. You've now got to replace the carpet, the mahogany table, the chairs, the curtains, the sheetrock. It's $100,000 fix. And that's the difference of what we're facing now. Let's do it right. Long-term solutions pay off. I'll give you an example in Niger, for example, where we put resilient, sustainable systems in place. When shocks hit, for example, and this is just an example, in Niger, 80% of the villages that we had sustainable long-term solutions did not need additional aid. When you do that, when you do the amortization schedule and do it right and over like a 30-year period, it's a major savings to taxpayers in America and around the world, and it stabilizes populations. And it proves once again, America is great because America is good. And when America ceases to be good, America ceases to be great. You know that quote that arguably came from de Tocqueville. So I'm ready for MAGA 2.0. Make America good again, because we can't be great if we're not good. And right now, we're not being good. So we've got short-term solutions, what we must do. Let me also add, and I spoke out extensively this to the United Nations and particularly to the G20. Don't hold yourself vulnerable to strategic minerals if a rogue nation decides it's going to exploit the situation like we had in the Russian war in Ukraine on fertilizer. Why don't we make certain that we have available fertilizer in other parts of the world so we're not susceptible to these types of shocks? Anyway, I've probably talked long enough, and let me kind of end with this story. Y'all, you know 60 Minutes. Scott Pelley and I did, and some of you may remember, it was one of the most powerful stories I think ever done to change U.S. and European policy overnight and Middle East policy about the blockade by the coalition in Hadeda in Yemen. And so Scott and I did the story, and we were finishing the story, and Scott was taking the microphone off me. And he looked at me and he said, Governor, you got the greatest job in the world, saving the lives of millions of people every day. And I said, Scott, I do. I really do. But I'm going to tell you something that you haven't thought of, and it's going to bother you. And, Scott's a pretty sharp guy. He looked at me like what could that be? And I said, I don't go to bed at night thinking about the children we saved. I go to bed at night brokenhearted over the children we couldn't reach. And when we don't have enough money to do what we need to do, I have to make the decision. My team, we have to make the decision which children eat, which children don't eat, which children live, which children die. How would you like that job, Scott? And he looked at me just totally aghast. Oh my God, I never thought about it. I said, well, it's not hypothetical with us. We have to make decisions like this every single day, and it's not right, especially when there's over $500 trillion worth of wealth. Then he went from you've got the greatest job in the world, to you got the worst job in the world. And then he said, how do you stay positive? I said, well, it's actually easier than you think. I said, when I'm out there and I see that child, and I believe that every human being is made in the image of God, and that's my little brother, that's my little sister, and I'll see that little child, might be a little girl, little boy, 3, 4, 5 years old of age, come from behind a war rubber building in Aleppo or Kandahar or wherever. And it's like a flower in the desert. And that's the child of God. That's what drives me. These are not numbers, statistics we're talking about. These are people. They have names, they have voices, they have faces. And here we are in our 250th anniversary year of the United States of America. We got to put this country back on right track. And for you to come together like you're coming together now, to me, is so important. I believe if the American people know the truth, and this is one thing I want to say to the media, because I believe when the American people know, and I don't think the American people understand the consequences of this war and what's devastating so many poor people around the world and the financial impact that it will have on the United States. Not just even get to the goodwill that we're talking about of the United States. We have been the most respected nation on the face of the planet. And every place we pull back, China, Russia, or extremists go in. So let's get our act together. We got a great nation. We've got great women and men in Washington and around this country. Let's get our act together. Let's get the plans together, formulate the right policy. And I'm hoping that the leaders in Washington will adhere and listen to what you have to say. So thank you for bearing with me. Forgive me for the technological little issues there. But anyway, thank you. Blessings to you. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I feel like I just went to church. I feel like I just went to church. Yeah.
And now we'll cut my video off intentionally.
Well, good morning. I'm David Lynch with the Washington Post. I cover the global economy for the Post and have written a couple of stories about the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz over the past couple of months. But fortunately, we have 3 experts who know more about it than I do. And we're going to try and drill down a little bit into what some of the implications are, current state of play, and what to expect down the line. I assume you've probably got bios in the program, so I won't go through long introductions, but we've got to my immediate left, Caitlin Welsh from CSIS, then Karen Young from Columbia, and Charlotte Heberbrand from IFPRI. So I think we've got the waterfront fully covered. We're going to talk, or I'm going to talk with them for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for your questions. So make sure you have some. Karen, maybe we could start with you, and others can jump in. Let's just set the table, put this in historical context. The disruption we've seen, we're now about to begin week 12 of what I think was supposed to be a 48-hour war. How much has been disrupted in food, fuel, and fertilizer shipments? And how does this compare to the oil crises of the 70s, the Russia invasion of Ukraine a couple of years ago, even the Houthis attacks in the Red Sea in 2023? Just put it in historical context for us.
Well, thank you, David, and it's great to be on this panel. And thank you to Intisar, my colleague here at MEI, for organizing this event. This is the largest supply disruption, certainly in oil markets, that we have ever seen historically. And what makes it so difficult as we get into now 2.5 months of the conflict is that we're beginning to see those sort of add-on effects of the disruption. So the traffic that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, it's crude. It's also refined product, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the disruption and certainly inflationary pressures on diesel and jet fuel and chemicals. And then also to natural gas. So the disruption to natural gas is a little bit different than what we saw in the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. We have not seen gas prices spike in the same way that they did then. But this is a crisis that is affecting different regions, different countries on a different timeline and in different ways. So it's really geographically disparate. That doesn't mean that we are insulated from it. It is coming, and it is absolutely arriving to the West. It hit South Asia and East Asia first. It's hitting emerging markets more now and comes to us. In gas markets, most importantly, the producer is Qatar from the Gulf. And Qatar had not just a blockage in terms of transport, but also damage to some really important and sophisticated equipment, gas to liquids facilities. So in the beginning of the war, Iran struck Ras Laffan in Qatar. Qatar exports about 20% of global LNG supply through the strait, and about 20% of their production has been impacted. Of course, they're exporting nothing right now. So the issue is if they've got 20% of their production, which is about 4% of global supply, which will be offline for what Qatar Energy suggests, 3 to 5 years. And that's a hit of about $20 billion per year for them in terms of revenues. And their estimate is about $26 billion of repair cost. And the reason why the gas matters, not just for electricity generation, which is a lot of what we use LNG for, it's also for industrial use. So the things that make steel and aluminum, but also the things that we turn gas into. And that's where the food security issue comes to play. So we rely on natural gas, on methane, to basically create nitrogen fertilizers, which are essentially ammonia. So you take the gas, you steam it, you separate the hydrogen, you add nitrogen, which comes from the air, and that creates ammonia. And then ammonia can be turned into products like urea, which is another kind of fertilizer, essentially by adding carbon dioxide. And then you've got a product which you turn into little pellets and you can ship cheaply and easily all over the world. And that's what farmers are depending on. And we'll hear more from experts on how we use fertilizer. But essentially, it's going to hit first, nitrogen-based fertilizers, which we use for things like corn and wheat. And this is a little different from 2022. Russia is an important fertilizer producer as well. But the gas issue was really critical in that time. But this is worse. So in terms of nitrogen-based fertilizers, ammonia, it's essentially twice as big a hit. About 11% of global supply of ammonia fertilizers are at risk. And then urea fertilizers, it's essentially 5 times as worse as it was in 2022. So that was about 3% hit. Now we're looking at more than 15% hit. So, that's the severity. It is different across products. And oil, we will feel in different ways. It's a little bit, we're not making up the difference. There is no spare capacity that matches what's in Saudi Arabia and across the GCC and Iraq. But we have a little bit of workarounds. We have those pipelines. There are no pipelines for refined products or for things like ammonia. So that is why you've got this stranglehold really on a significant part of global supply for these products. And I think, the political takeaway right now is that we don't see a resumption of that traffic flow really anytime soon. So even if we get a political agreement, a more lasting ceasefire, it doesn't change the threat perception within the region and traffic flow and shipping considerations. And it doesn't resolve what Iran might have as leverage over the strait. So this is what we understand quite well now in oil and gas markets, but have probably not appreciated significantly in what that means in gas-based products like fertilizer.
And Charlotte, how are fertilizer markets globally behaving in the face of this situation?
Yeah, so first of all, let me express also my gratitude to the Institute for having this session, and also to honor David Beasley, who I think gave a great presentation and was a tremendous leader of the World Food Program. We recently had Cindy McCain at IFPRI, and she also, these are really dedicated international public servants. So I just want to pay tribute to both of them. And then I also want to thank Karen for that incredibly good explanation of how ammonia is produced. And maybe just to take us a little bit back in time, because I think, we don't always know what we mean when we talk about fertilizers. So if you go back to the late 1800s, sorry, just a quick...
We only do have the 40 minutes.
a quick journey. So the world was fearing that we were running out of fertilizers, because back then we relied on ammonium nitrate, which was mined, and we relied on guano, which was basically bird waste. And the mountains of bird waste had basically been used up. So the world was on a mad dash to try to figure out how can you make synthetic fertilizers. And that was a tremendous breakthrough, scientific breakthrough by a German scientist, Fritz Haber, who won the Nobel Prize for this invention of how you make ammonia. And then it was sort of industrialized by a German industrialist, by Bosch, who also won a Nobel Prize for engineering for that. So it was a tremendous breakthrough. Ever since we've had this opportunity to make synthetic fertilizers, you can see the fertilizer increase is right in line with the population increase. So the estimate right now is that more than 50% or around 50% of the world's food supply is there because of these mineral fertilizers. So just to kind of put it into proportion, why this is so important. I think we only seem to care about fertilizers when there's a crisis like the one we have now, but historically it was a huge breakthrough that we had these products. So, and then I think in terms of your question, David, there's a big, first of all, I would say that the blockage obviously has impacted the Gulf countries, right? Because they're huge food importers. So all of that right now is also not happening. So even the Gulf countries, who generally don't have big problems around food security, may be confronted with some difficult situations. So that's one point to make. And then in terms of all of the things coming out, it's a double whammy for the fertilizer sector, because as Karen said, you need LNG, you need natural gas to produce ammonia. You can use oil, but natural gas has really, the use of natural gas has increased because it's environmentally more friendly than using oil. China, which is one of the largest producers of fertilizer, still uses primarily oil, which is interesting. But so if the natural gas can't leave the Gulf to go to major other fertilizer producing countries like India, Pakistan, so they can't produce enough ammonia themselves. And then of course, in addition to that, you have the finished fertilizer products that are coming from the Gulf. So in total, about 30% of globally traded fertilizers is right now stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. And it's even higher for some products. Urea, which is the most commonly used nitrogen fertilizer, about 40% of global trade is impacted. Sulfur, which is a byproduct of oil and gas refining, but is also a very important ingredient to producing phosphate fertilizers, is 50% of the global sulfur trade is impacted because of the Gulf region. Phosphates is another one. I think it's about around 30% of the global phosphate production is also stuck right now. Saudi Arabia, just in the last couple of decades, has come on really strong as a phosphate producer. So big issues, and it's playing out differently, I would say, for importing countries and exporting countries, but maybe we can get
we'll
to that.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Caitlin, sometimes I think when I listen to experts like the three of you, the consequences seem incredibly dire, and yet life is going on, at least here. It feels to me a little bit like the global economy is like one of those cartoon characters that has run off the cliff and doesn't quite recognize that yet. So the clock's ticking. The president has teased an imminent end to this war. I've lost count of how many times. Let's assume a settlement is reached at some point. How long is it going to take for a resumption of the normal commerce in all of these areas, oil, fertilizer, et cetera? How long is it going to take us from the day of quote unquote peace to get back to normal?
Thanks for that question. And thanks also to MEI for hosting us today. And again, to former WFP Executive Director David Beasley for his great remarks. In terms of your important question, I'll answer that in terms of days, weeks, months, and years, because as you proposed, if a settlement were reached and the Strait of Hormuz were reopened, then it takes days and weeks for ships to start moving. When it comes to the to months and years, it will take, as as Dr. Young mentioned, up to years to rebuild some of the production facilities that have been attacked. And then beyond that, some of the impacts of high fertilizer prices are already baked in. So we're going to be seeing those play out in months to come. Farmers who have been affected by high fertilizer prices in this growing season, they've already had to make planting decisions based on high fertilizer prices. When fertilizer prices rise, farmers have essentially three choices that they face. They can apply less fertilizer, they reduce acreage that they're planting, or they switch crops. So they switch planting from fertilizer intensive crops to less fertilizer, high fertilizer intensive crops to less fertilizer intensive crops. And all of that in aggregate has the impact of either reducing the quantity of crops produced or the nature of crops produced. So what we're seeing is that at this point, nearing 3 months in this war, impacts on this planting season are already baked in, and they'll play out in months to come. Globally,
Yeah.
yes. Mainly across the Northern Hemisphere, because it's spring planting season in Northern Hemisphere countries. But this is from countries ranging from the United States to Africa to China, India, all over the Northern Hemisphere.
Wow.
At the same time that farmers in the Southern Hemisphere would be pre-purchasing their fertilizer. So they're already being affected in the Southern Hemisphere. So in months to come, we're going to be seeing the impacts of high fertilizer prices on agricultural production. We're not seeing those immediately, but those will play out in months to come. And then I'll mention something else that maybe we can address later, or maybe we can talk about right now.
Sure.
Even if fertilizers were not implicated in this war, I would hope that we would still be having an event like this on impacts of high energy prices on agriculture markets and on food security, because high energy prices alone affect food security around the world for three main reasons. First of all, that energy prices push food prices higher. Inevitably, it takes a little bit longer, but it pushes food prices higher, slows economic growth. So at a macro level and also at the household level, incomes can fall. And the third way is that governments may have less fiscal space to respond to higher food prices and to families who may need support in times like this. So high energy prices alone push food insecurity higher, and then add to this equation high fertilizer prices.
I want to talk about that fiscal piece in a moment, but I'd be interested from each of you, at what point, if the current status quo continues, at what point do you get really concerned about dire outcomes, famine, unrest, something that even Americans would be hard pressed to ignore?
I can take that. I think we should not panic. And that sounds a little bit strange after we're talking about the rise in prices, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So when you look back at the crisis after the invasion of Ukraine, right, we had a similar situation in the fertilizer market. But by and large, yes, there were some difficult situations, some short-term disruptions, but by and large, markets actually did find a way to adjust. So I also don't want us to, I think we shouldn't exacerbate it. Of course, the longer fertilizer stays stuck in the Strait of Hormuz, the bigger the problem is. But right now, to Caitlin's point, at IFPRI, we've done some modeling to try to understand the impact of the fuel, diesel, and fertilizer prices on a number of low-income countries. And the assumptions, of course, probably are changing. We envisaged a 60% increase in fuel prices through the end of the year and 40% of fertilizers. And basically, the impact is there both on GDP, poverty reduction, as well as food security. But most of the impact is, in our model, coming from the fuel sector. So just to kind of put it in proportion, the other thing to say is, fertilizers, there are ways to adjust to having less fertilizers. What makes this situation, in a way, it's sort of a double-edged sword. Food prices are actually much lower than they were after Russia was invaded, because Ukraine, as you said, I think, David, is a major breadbasket, right? So you had a hit on fertilizers and on agricultural commodities. Today, that's not the case. By and large, we have pretty comfortable stocks. Prices have started to inch up, but what that means for farmers have to think about the affordability of fertilizers, right? So if the prices are high, food prices, they can recoup their costs on fertilizers. So high food prices, in a way, are good for at least wealthy farmers, because they can then afford the higher priced fertilizers. But on the other hand, if food prices don't go up as much, it's good for humanity, because we all need to buy food. But actually, it will lead to reduced fertilizer application. But the other thing I want to say is, 1 year in a country of reduced fertilizer application does not immediately translate into famine. It's problematic, especially for nitrogen, because that is probably the nutrient that provides the most agricultural productivity growth. But if you skip a year of potash or phosphate, it's not the end of the world. It's not great for your soils. And again, if we look at the aftershock after the invasion of Ukraine, we didn't see a huge decline in agricultural yields. And farmers do switch to other crops that are less fertilizer intensive. So it's a problem, yes, but I don't think it's too early to talk about a potential famine in some parts of the world, in my view. But
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. I'll just jump in to say that it depends on the place you're talking about as well, because you have some countries that are reliant on the Gulf for their fertilizer inputs or fertilizer final products whose imports source has been disrupted, that may be on the brink or may already be experiencing humanitarian catastrophe. And at the same time that fertilizer markets are disrupted, energy prices are rising, and humanitarian assistance is more difficult to deliver for a whole host of reasons. So in countries like that, we're seeing countries like Afghanistan or Sudan, countries like that, or Somalia, much more worried about famine or conditions approaching famine than we are in other places. I will say, though, that we are seeing effects around the world. And I mentioned earlier in our conversation that even in the United States, we're seeing an expectation that farmers are shifting away from corn and wheat, which are more fertilizer intensive, and towards soybeans, which are less fertilizer intensive. Depends on the source when it comes to the question of did even American farmers have enough access to fertilizer this planting season. Some are saying that most farmers did. Some surveys are saying that most farmers did not. So again, even farmers in the United States are affected by this.
Yeah, I remember talking to somebody, I think from the Corn Growers Association, who was talking about the fact that most of their members had already bought most of their fertilizer when the price spike happened.
Yes.
But they were worried if the disruption continued into August, that the purchases for next season would start then. And so you'd have this lingering effect into 27.
Yeah, that's precisely right.
Yeah. Let's talk about the fiscal part of this, because whether it's oil or fertilizer, the prices are going up. That's got to be problematic for a number of countries and for individuals therein. Karen, can you talk about that a little bit? What are the places that are feeling this most acutely? How are they responding? How are these importing countries responding? Are they subsidizing? Are they, it's not the greatest example, but I saw even in Japan the other day, apparently a very popular maker of potato chips or something.
Now it's in a black and white package.
Exactly. They ran out of naphtha, so they had to do away with the colors.
So yeah, the longer we get into this disruption, and it really is a reconfiguration of our energy system. that we're experiencing. And as we draw from inventories, we are seeing less crude going into refineries. Refinery kind of processing now is down about 4.5 million barrels a day. So that means that there's not enough paint. There's not enough of these, all kinds of products. Particularly, it raises the price of diesel, which is important for transit, but also any kind of like farming equipment or mining equipment of potash. So these are kind of these add-on effects. And different countries decide to deal with the problem with the resources that they have. So we are in the age now of energy security as a top-line concern. And so how does that translate into the policy world? Well, Egypt announced in its own export of fertilizers that it would charge a $90 tax per ton on any kind of nitrogen fertilizer that leaves the country. Why are they doing that? Well, it's a money-making opportunity, but also it's meant to reserve more supply for domestic use. India, the same way, under tremendous pressure. And India traditionally, as a government, subsidizes the price of fertilizer and fuels for its economy. And in a moment like this, you're going to see, and they also export, that other countries are going to say, hey, that's not fair because your agricultural production is getting a bit of a benefit. So there are going to be these, you can think of them as market disruptions or manipulations, but that's politics, right? And every government right now is thinking about, how do I deal with a shortage of refined product, maybe not enough access to the crude that I need, and what do I do about it? And in poorer countries, the first thing governments do is decide to mess with demand. So they essentially say, you're going to drive to work 3 days a week. We're going to close certain offices. This is a major issue also, to use India as an example, in all kinds of supply chains, particularly for manufactured equipment with aluminum and steel. I spoke with a company earlier this week which relies on production of valves for oil services in the Gulf that are produced in India. They're closing factories. Factories are only working 2 or 3 days a week. So if you have a supply chain that relies on a production in a country that has energy constraints, supply constraints, that messes with your business. That's a problem. So this has myriad effects. Governments like Japan, this is also about stockpiling. Japan has 244 days of crude reserves in storage. That's great for them. The Philippines, Thailand, actually Myanmar is the absolute worst. They are the most vulnerable in terms of crude and refined product imports from the region, and zero, very, very little storage and inventory at home. So those countries will suffer more.
Are there any places that any of you are worried about that could tumble into fiscal distress as a function of this? I mean, Japan will get through this, the United States will get through this, but are there heavily indebted countries that are perhaps scarce of dollars that are now facing larger oil import bills and fertilizer bills on top of it? Or is this still something that you think can be navigated?
No, I think it will be challenging, certainly for countries. I mean, there's increasing levels of debt in the developing world, so it's going to be very challenging. And some countries are not even able, I think, to provide any kind of support in terms of subsidies at this time. Others may do so. India, of course, it's not really a developing country anymore. What's interesting about India is that I would maybe just briefly group importing countries into several categories. So you've got major agricultural breadbaskets around the world, like Brazil, Argentina, Australia. All of them are huge importers of fertilizers. They, by and large, they're trying to scour the market and trying to buy as much as they can from the reduced supply. They will get by because they're big markets. So producers and traders are probably going to have an interest in servicing those markets. Then you have India, which is really interesting. India is a huge importer of fertilizers. It has an ambition to become self-sufficient, but it still relies heavily on imports. And India has forever subsidized fertilizers. Right now, you can buy salt at a cheaper price than urea in India because it's so heavily subsidized, especially nitrogen fertilizers. So they have upped their subsidy bill. And India makes up 20% of global urea demand. So it's a huge, huge player in terms of urea use. But basically, by providing subsidies, which in some years, fertilizer subsidies in India can be as high as their national defense budget, just to kind of put it into proportion. It's huge. It is actually a question of national security, I think, in India, right? As it is in China, fertilizers is really, really important to these countries. But what that means for the rest of the world, right? So India has already increased its subsidy allotment for the Kharif season, which is underway. But it insulates basically demand, right? Usually when prices go up, people buy less and then prices eventually come down. But here you've got 20% of urea consumption in the world basically protected. So they're not listening to any market signals, which is kind of a problem for the Australias and the Brazils of this world, because they have to then make all of the adjustment in terms of the market. But what's also interesting about India, I think the fiscal pressure is getting to be problematic, because just 2 days ago, I think Modi made an announcement saying it wasn't like a mandate, but he said we should be moving more into organic fertilizers. We should rely 50% for our plant nutrition needs on organic fertilizers. So clearly, they're thinking about how can they reduce this tremendous fiscal burden in a place like India.
Caitlin, I think it was you who mentioned to me when we were talking about this panel that, putting aside the importing countries, that actually there are some interesting angles to the exporters, right? That they can wield their prominence, their ability to continue producing at a time when others are disrupted, for greater political influence and leverage globally. Explain a little bit what you had in mind.
Certainly, yeah. We definitely saw this after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where Russia deliberately attacked all aspects of Ukraine's agricultural system to undercut Ukraine's production and exports. Russia, at the same time, benefited from good growing conditions, had historic high levels of wheat production and exports, to the point that actually the year following the invasion, 1 in 4 tons of wheat on global markets was actually of Russian origin. So Russia capitalized not only on its higher production and exports, but on the fact that Ukraine was producing and exporting less, to increase Russian exports to food importing countries. And we actually worked with colleagues at IFPRI to quantify these impacts. We saw that Russian exports of wheat, for example, increased to all regions of Africa. Already in North Africa and the Middle East, Russia had enormous market shares. At that time, for example, in the Middle East, Russia's market share of the wheat market in the Middle East increased to 59%, so an enormous market share there. Russia delivered free food and free fertilizers to countries in sub-Saharan Africa. All of this, I think, in an effort to increase influence and to curry favor among food importing countries at a time when Russia wanted support on a global stage for the war that it was waging. I also think that food exports have an especially important and a different valence, a different practical and symbolic importance than other exports, than energy or military, because I think that leaders of countries understand that when their sources of food imports are under threat, then there's the risk that food prices will rise. And when that happens, populations are unhappy and they register that discontent either at the ballot box or in social unrest or riots that can change regimes. What we're seeing right now is slightly different, but there's a potential for such impact. So, for example, right now we did see earlier on in this war that when exports of fertilizer from the Gulf fell, you saw that in some countries in Africa that their imports of fertilizer from Russia were increasing. Ghana and Nigeria were pre-placing more orders of fertilizer from Russia. Now, I don't expect that dynamic to continue necessarily, because Russia is capping its fertilizer exports right now, but we did see that earlier on. When it comes to liquefied petroleum gas, which is a major export from the Gulf, which is a major source of cooking fuel, including in places like India, which we both mentioned, you're seeing that India is still able to export LPG through the Strait of Hormuz. I think at last count I saw 13 ships, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot in this environment. As a major source of cooking fuel, because families they need to continue cooking. And one Indian shipbroker put it this way: he said that Iran is forcing countries to choose between Western alignment and energy stability. And of course, we know that a UAE minister said that this is extortion on a global scale. So all this to say that global commodity market disruptions and global agriculture commodity market disruptions present opportunities for other countries, including U.S. strategic adversaries, to capitalize.
Yeah. And how does, this episode comes obviously after the U.S. has eviscerated its own foreign aid programs. And I would imagine many of the affected countries point the finger at Washington for beginning the war that led to this interruption of trade. How does the U.S. retrenchment on the foreign aid side of things interact with this the cutoff of these substances, the trade? In other words, to the extent that the same places that are hurting were probably places that were benefiting from U.S. programs that are no longer operational.
I could perhaps give a pre-answer, but then perhaps, Charlotte, maybe you can fill in from some of the conversation you had earlier this week. But when this dynamic was playing out across Africa that I mentioned after the Russia-Ukraine war, food prices increased to a historic high globally. Many countries in Africa saw food insecurity increase. And what you saw essentially was tit-for-tat diplomacy between Russia and the United States, almost on a weekly basis, where Russia would send high-level diplomats to talk about the importance of Russian food exports and how they were going to improve food security. And then the United States would send our Treasury Secretary or our USAID administrator to talk about U.S. assistance and say that we're actually helping address the problem to a greater extent. I don't see the United States. It isn't playing the same role right now. But Charlotte had mentioned that she was having some conversations earlier this week about this. So.
Yeah, maybe before I do that, I want to go back to, I sort of gave this big picture of importing countries. I didn't mean to neglect Africa. And Africa deserves special focus here, also in relation to your question about the aid decreasing. So Africa, by and large, consumes about 4% of global fertilizer consumption. So it's minuscule, right? Fertilizer use in Africa is extremely low. It's about 20 kilograms per hectare. The global average is about 135 kilograms per hectare. And since it makes up such a small slice of the market, it's a market taker. So the Africans, unlike the Brazils or the Indias, that are big markets, Africa tends to get cut out when the going gets tough in the fertilizer market. It's hard to export to Africa. The ports still aren't big enough for these mega boats. The inland, there's incredible still logistical transportation constraints. Fertilizer prices tend to be 3 to 4 times higher in Africa than in the rest of the world because of all of those reasons. So for all of those reasons, Africa is really vulnerable when they can't access more fertilizer. They're already using so little. So there, I would say I'm most alarmed about what could happen in Africa. And then, of course, combined with the decrease in aid, not, by the way, just from the US, but really across the gap. Even, if you look at German development policy, UK development policy, the language may not be quite as, America first, but it's not so dissimilar. So there are I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in how development assistance is being provided. So yeah, it is certainly worrisome, I think, especially for Africa. What's interesting in Africa is there is actually, and this is sort of one of the big ironies of this situation, there is fertilizer production in Africa. But sadly, most of that is actually being exported because, again, the attraction lies with these big markets, and it's much harder to sell, let's say, within West Africa because it's just so complicated, and the demand is not necessarily there because farmers don't use that much. So, in the longer run, I do think Africa is, and the African Union they're holding a ministerial actually on the fertilizer situation in a couple of days, I think. I don't remember the exact date. And they have set themselves this ambition to really, become more self-sufficient in fertilizers. But it's hard. It's not that easy. That's a very long-term goal, I think, that but they're going to try to see how they can make that happen.
Yeah. We've already seen discussion as recently as today. I think the UAE green lighted a new pipeline for which Karen probably knows more about than I do, to develop another east-west land route to reduce the dependence upon the strait for moving crude oil. First, how much of that kind of work do you see coming out of this crisis, and how much of a difference will it make? I think, thinking on the one hand, it's an obvious alternative to the seaborne trade, so that's a good thing. On the other hand, pipelines are vulnerable targets as well to drones. So how much of a success is that likely to have? And then second part of that question, what can we do along those lines or other lines to make the global fertilizer trade less vulnerable to these kind of repeated geopolitical shocks?
So yes, that it's ADCOP 2. ADCOP 1 is the pipeline that runs from the Persian Gulf side out to Fujairah, which carries about 1.8 million barrels a day. And yes, that tender actually closed a while ago. Chinese company is the EPC that will be building it, and it will be parallel the same route to Fujairah. But that's a crude pipeline. It does nothing for fertilizer, right? It might help in terms of our energy mix, and that crude could go somewhere else and be refined into diesel to help with transportation costs. But it will take 18 months, 2 years to construct it. It's great, and we'll see lots of redundancies. I expect Saudi Arabia will also build a parallel east-west pipeline. We may see the reconfiguration or rehabilitation of the existing pipeline that runs from Iraq through Saudi Arabia, the IPSA. So yeah, you're going to see a lot of CapEx on this energy infrastructure, but those are crude pipelines. What would help in terms of this crisis is a gas problem. So there is some talk about building a gas pipeline from Qatar to Turkey. That would be a big project, and it would go through multiple sovereign jurisdictions. It would be expensive, and I don't think there's any tender in process in place. So gas and then turning gas into other products requires sophisticated equipment. Yeah, I suppose we'll be building things like that in different places. I mean, essentially, what is lost to market in LNG supply because of the damage to Ras Laffan is essentially the same investment that Qatar Energy has made here in the United States in Golden Pass. That'll be about 4% of global production. So, what we'll see as a trend line is national oil companies, energy companies from the Gulf, building out infrastructure in other places, buying assets in other places. And as governments think about energy security, thinking about their own inventories and stockpiles, building more storage facilities, and certainly probably building some new refineries. Not a whole lot of refineries being built around the world right now as a result of this crisis. But for we can get fertilizer in the nitrogen form, which requires ammonia and gas. You can also mine it from potassium. So we might see that in other places. You can use phosphate. So, but these, as I think was really eloquently explained, don't have the bang for the buck in terms of agricultural productivity. But maybe, countries make choices. So the outcome of this conflict is essentially inflationary, where governments make redundancies, choices about their energy infrastructure, their supply chains, in ways that protect them, but ultimately cost more. And so we have to think about that as a long-term effect that is our energy system, our food system, and the way that governments relate and deal with each other on a trade level.
I mean, maybe I can just add to that,
Sure.
and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this, Karen. I mean, I think both the energy sector and the fertilizer sector are very prone to shocks, right? And the reason is because you've got a few producers in the world that are really, really big, and they're providing fuel and fertilizers to many countries. So in the long run, maybe renewables are actually a big part of the answer here, right?
And
And-
South Korea is making a big push in
Right.
that direction.
And even in the
response to this.
fertilizer space, there is technology that is readily available to produce what's called green ammonia, where you get the hydrogen through electrolysis rather than through the Haber-Bosch method. It's feasible, it's just expensive compared to the traditional way of making ammonia. But the Chinese, for example, are investing now, I think, in a green ammonia plant in Africa. A large Moroccan company, one of the largest phosphate, Morocco is the country with the largest phosphate reserves. They're also investing in green ammonia because they need the ammonia to produce phosphatic and nitrogenous fertilizers. So in the long run, I think that could be a solution, but I don't know that we're really moving in all parts of the world with equal speed towards renewables.
Yeah.
And then just one other thing, I think in the long run, adjusting, we have to bear in mind that fertilizers, if you could take a magic wand and say countries that are over applying fertilizers, if they would just use the correct amount and then give the rest to other countries that are underusing, we'd have enough fertilizers.
Right.
The reality is fertilizers are wasted in many, many parts of the world, and that actually also has some serious environmental implications. So I think the long term, and this is where I think the development assistance comes in as well, right? We're not investing in things like agricultural extension. We're not investing in, tools, digital tools that help farmers apply fertilizers correctly. It's actually, it's a knowledge intensive thing to apply fertilizers. You can't just
You don't
spread
just
them.
dump it.
You need to know what you're growing, what the nutrient needs are of that crop, what's in your soil, what the weather looks like, all of these things. But we're not facilitating that knowledge. And sometimes it's just too cheap, the fertilizer, right? So nobody needs to worry about that. So I think in terms of just policies, there are many things we could do to make this sector a bit less prone to these kinds of shocks.
Great. Well, we want to try and keep it as close to schedule as we can, so we're going to open it up for a few minutes of questions. Who would like to start? In the back.
Hi, thank you, Rachel Ziemba. Really great conversation. I think you alluded to this, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are for any regional cooperation to address any of these issues. I've noticed in Asia, there's sort of bilateral swaps that are starting to develop. Maybe this is a sign of challenges to the multilateral order. You talked about how this is, the US is not trying to solve this problem the same way as maybe in 2022, even though then there were limitations. But I'm just wondering if there are any regional groupings or other things that you're seeing, or any prospect for multilateral development banks, the IMF, other things like that in this context. And maybe it's more the energy side.
Sure.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for the question. I'll jump in by complementing some of the things that Charlotte and Karen were saying in response to the last question, but also offering a potential for regional cooperation. In terms of responses, there is no quick fix. I think everybody wants a quick fix to the challenges that we're seeing. So many of the impacts are already baked in. As I mentioned, one of the longer term responses that I'd like to add is the development of crops that rely on less fertilizer, which underscores the importance of investing in institutions like IFPRI and like the CGIAR system. I see some major agricultural companies already investing in that and talking about that publicly. So that's a longer term solution, but it's not a quick fix. In terms of multilateral cooperation, also looking at this through the lens of solutions right now, there's been discussion for at least a month, maybe a month and a half, about having something akin to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was the regime among Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN to facilitate Ukraine's grain exports and some of Russia's fertilizer exports after the invasion started. There have been discussions ongoing. There's a special envoy appointed right now to see if that can be initiated. The latest that I'm hearing is that when talk about reopening the strait is really strong, when there's hope that that's going to happen, then interest in a similar regime for the Strait of Hormuz declines. When people are not hopeful, then this UN official gets a lot of phone calls about, can we actually do this? What I will say is that should an initiative, and I'll be again watching this with a lot of interest, for the Strait of Hormuz be implemented, I think it could have short-term positive impacts on fertilizer prices, fertilizer markets, and ag production. It's not a long-term solution, just like the Black Sea Grain Initiative was not a long-term solution. The ultimate solution will come in the reopening of the strait.
Maybe it doesn't directly answer your question, but we haven't talked about trade much, right? So I think the other factor right now are, I mean, we have talked a little bit about these export restrictions. China is really important here. China is a huge fertilizer producer. China has had export controls of some shape or form since 2021. And it's already had huge impacts on the market and on prices. If China decided, and they're looking now whether they might relax some of their export restrictions on urea, but they've actually just announced new export restrictions on sulfur. But if they decided from one day to the next to adjust that, it would have an immediate impact on lowering prices. Indonesia has export restrictions. Egypt, as you mentioned.
And are these aimed from the Chinese perspective at maintaining their domestic
Absolutely. It's,
supplies?
in a lot of countries, fertilizers is seen as a very strategic, a strategic good because it's so closely linked to food security. So in Egypt, for example, there's a certain allotment that has to be met that you sell to your domestic market before you're allowed to export. Indonesia, same thing. And these are all really large producers of nitrogenous fertilizers. So that has another impact on markets. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz. And in a way, to be, I'm being a little bit playing devil's advocate here, but if the Strait of Hormuz opens tomorrow, you're not going to see immediate, like the ships are going to be nervous,
Yeah.
the insurance rates are going to be through the roof, people aren't going to trust this. If China decides tomorrow to relax their export restrictions, you'll have an immediate impact on fertilizer prices. So, I don't want us to only focus on the Strait of Hormuz because these other things are also really important. If India stopped subsidizing, fertilizer prices would go down. So, just to say there are many different pieces to this. And then on the trade, we not only have we seen this decline in aid, but our trade regime, our international trade coordination is like, where are we, right? The WTO is very weak. We did manage to get some time back, some disciplines on export restrictions on food. So the WFP, David Beasley's ex-organization, they are allowed to buy humanitarian food from countries that have export restrictions in place. It's a very specific exemption. Could we do something similar for fertilizers? In this climate, probably not, but I think that would be, really something amazing if we could do that. So thinking about fertilizers as a humanitarian product in a similar way as given how closely linked it is to food.
Sure. Okay. Who's next? Yes, ma'am. Oh, just wait for the mic, please.
Do you think that this crisis will encourage or convince the United States to invest in green energy, or do we have to wait till a Democratic president in 2028?
Who would like to take a bite of that? Karen?
Sure. So there are a lot of things happening because of this energy supply crisis. And yes, renewables will be a beneficiary in many ways, but mostly to China. So China has the solar supply chain, they have the EV ability and a very good product to market, and they're doing that. And actually in this vein of like trade negotiation, so China has export bans on a lot of products, including refined fuel products. But for those neighbors that are really in a crunch, they've basically made side deals. And countries that agree to a long-term supply chain and renewables purchase from China are getting diesel, jet fuel, LPG. They're getting things they need because China's so well stockpiled. So this is an opportunity for some governments to make longer-term trade relationships in renewables in particular. So that's good for climate. It also certainly is good for China. In the United States, I think you're actually going to see movement certainly in solar, probably more adoption of EVs as people pay $5 or $6 a gallon for gas. But in many countries, you're also seeing gas to coal switching for electricity generation. So we are, if at best, climate neutral on a global scale there.
Could I make one quick intervention?
Sure.
The US just increased their biofuel mandate, which is sort of the worst timing, right? Because we're worried about high food prices, and actually the price of soybeans has gone up largely, I think, because of biodiesel. mandates. So yeah, so I guess that's renewable biofuels, but you know, the timing is always tricky. But other kinds of renewables right now are, I think, not top of the agenda.
Yeah, 2029. Yes.
Hi, thank you for doing this. Valentina Pasquale with AGBI. How worried should Gulf exporters, and I guess this is true on both the energy and fertilizer side, that this race to find alternatives to their products in the short term will lead to a loss of market share that is permanent to some extent?
Good question.
I think for oil markets, this doesn't change too much, who has spare capacity. The US can't make up what Saudi Arabia does for markets. But yes, there will be reconsiderations based on energy security concerns. Having a diversity of supply across products will be important to everyone. For gas, this is a major impediment to Qatar's market share. But they are moving ahead with their North Shore or North Field expansion. And this will play out 2027, 2028 and beyond, where we probably will have more gas on the market than we need. But who knows? So on those, on the hydrocarbon side, I don't think it changes terribly too much. It is encouraging investment in not just exploration, but production in places with higher political risk that didn't look so appealing a year or so ago. We saw new contracts signed in Libya, actually just before this conflict started. But Libya, Algeria will benefit, Venezuela certainly, and probably some better, perhaps gas opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa that didn't go so well before. Apparently, Iraqi contract terms for oil exploration right now are the best in the world from an IOC perspective. So it changes the calculus for sure.
What about U.S. hopes of greater LNG exports?
We have increased already and will continue to do so. But that is, as I said before, with the investment from often Gulf national energy companies.
Mm-hmm. Maybe just on the fertilizer sector to answer your question, it's interesting because the Gulf countries have actually diversified into fertilizers just in the last few decades because they didn't want to be solely reliant on energy. And now they must also feel a double pinch, right, on that front. But I do think that they're also investing in some renewables, no?
Yes.
Some of these countries. So, I think they're trying to hedge their bets as much as they can.
Any other questions?
Great.
Last chance, going once. Yep. Karen has a flight
I have
to
a
catch,
flight
which
to
is
catch,
why she
so I
said
might
great.
have to run.
But we'll do it very quickly. We'll do a lightning round. Quick question,
So-
quick answer.
Okay. I'm interested in particular in the role of Morocco and opportunities that the crisis presents for Morocco because it has the world's largest reserves of phosphates, but I understand it's also constrained because of some of the other parts of the supply chain.
I
So
would
what
defer to the
opportunities-
lady sitting in front of you. She's our
Right.
Morocco
Yes.
expert.
Yeah, just so what opportunities does Morocco have, I guess, other than green hydrogen, which you've talked about a little bit?
Okay, great. Well, let me thank the panelists for a job well done. I hope you folks enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. We now have a 5-minute coffee break before the next panel.
Yeah, that was good. Great to meet you.
Hey, how are you?
Hi,
All right. So
do you hear me well?
yes.
We have a,
Hold on just a moment. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. Just need, if you can just start sharing your
Yes.
screen that you're going to share your slides, we'll just make sure that's working.
Do you see it correctly?
Yep. Yeah, that looks great. And we hear you fine. So I think we're good to go.
Cool.
I guess
So, yeah,
do you want to just go full screen to make sure that looks fine?
yeah. I think that's no, probably the most full screen I can go because I'm using. Let me show. Because I have to say, it's the first time I used Cloud Design to make them, but it's a HTML, and I'm not sure how now to make it to not to show the frame of
Maybe right click on the slide.
yeah.
It's one of those, say, full screen.
Full screen.
Or it could be in the browser itself.
Maybe I'll just email it to you directly.
Okay, yeah.
Let's see. What is your email address?
Yeah. Does it look better?
Yeah, it's fine. If this is what you're doing,
Yeah.
this is acceptable. That's totally fine. So I think we're
Okay.
good. All right,
Perfect.
appreciate it.
Perfect.
We'll remute on this end, but feel free to leave your camera on and we'll switch on the
Okay. I will
moment.
just turn off the audio for safety.
Okay. All right.
Back, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started.
Look at my notes.
So the first panel did a great job giving us a clear picture of the supply shock, the mechanics of the disruption. We heard about the political dynamics around it a little bit as well, and some of the early policy responses on the side of the government. What I want to do is move from the global picture to the downstream consequences and focus a little bit more on our part of the world, so North Africa and the Middle East. And the question I want us to focus on is, what does all this mean for the people at the end of the supply chain? For those who have not been able to secure their input just yet, for households that are struggling to afford basic food items, and then of course for governments that don't have as much buffer to deal with this shock. So joining me to discuss this are Eugenio da Crema. Eugenio is dialing in from Rome. He is an early warning economic risk analyst at the World Food Program. I also have Aaron Renninger. Aaron is the General Counsel and Chief of Strategic Relations at the World Central Kitchen. And finally, Shalar Erzden, Deputy Chief Economist for MENA at the World Bank. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
So, Eugenio, I'd like to start with you. WFP works on a 6-month early warning horizon. Walk us through what you are seeing. What is the data telling you in terms of the current pressure points and where things might be heading?
Sorry, I'm trying to set up my slides and okay. Okay. So as you said, we work on a 6-month horizon. So we work basically on emergencies. And of course, we have been monitoring closely what's happening in the Middle East, of course, and the rest of the world in the last months as a consequence of especially of the Hormuz crisis in the strict sense, in the sense of the oil crisis that is unfolding because of it. We have a situation at the moment that still looks like shocks that we have witnessed in the last years that had pretty significant consequences in a short, medium term, but didn't have, fortunately, too much consequences in the long term. I'm referring especially the last shock of this kind we saw, especially in the Middle East, was 2022 when we had the combined impact of both the food prices increases due to the Ukraine invasion, but also the macroeconomic effects of the raising interest rates especially in advanced economies in the US that drained money out, especially of the most fragile, macroeconomically fragile economies in the region and in the world. So in that period, we've seen the similar level of macroeconomic problems emerging, and with the same sort of ranking of countries most exposed and most impacted, which is roughly the same we have seen now. And although in this case the main transmission is due to oil prices and energy prices in general. The most exposed countries actually are not so much early warning, as you can imagine, are countries that we monitor every day because they are the most among the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, which are Sudan, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. The main characteristic that makes them, apart from being already in crisis themselves, they've been in a long time, the main characteristic that make them the tier one countries is the transmission. Since these countries are obviously institutions that are heavily deteriorated, they don't have any real buffer to against a sharp increase in international commodity prices on any commodity, but food, the basic commodities like food or oil. And we see already the transmission being passed into household level in the last weeks and actually month. The tier two countries are those countries that don't fortunately don't have any ongoing conflict or post-conflict situation, apart from Iraq, maybe to some extent, but are countries that have historically and also most recently heavy macroeconomic imbalances and macroeconomic problems that have affected them in the last years. In Egypt and Tunisia, I would say Egypt in particular, is a country that has already been in part bailed out in 2022 due to the massive investment outflows and in parallel with the sharp increase in food prices in 2022 that caused a slow motion balance of payment crisis in the country during that period. We are not yet there in the case of these three countries, but obviously the buffer they have are thin, and we expect that if this crisis is protracted for long, these countries can see significant problems. In part, they have already seen a significant increase in prices. The tier two countries, so we monitor them, but we consider them potentially affected, but in the longer run, are Jordan and Morocco. I would say Jordan more than Morocco, but for reasons that we will. Jordan, in certain for certain criteria, maybe it's more a tier two country, but for a reason we see later, we think it's still a country we can keep in tier three. Now we focus on the tier one countries, so Sudan, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. These are the most recent food security data points we have on these countries. For Sudan, Syria, and Lebanon, these are data that were collected latest in March. So they reflect only in little part the impact of the conflict, but we already see an increase in all of three. We have seen a 400,000 increase in Sudan, roughly 1 million increase in Syria, and Lebanon not so much, but Lebanon has been have seen the last food security analysis we had. Was in a period of the post-war period last year, so it was quite dire situation already. So we're talking about among the biggest food security crises in the world, together probably only with Myanmar and DRC. Especially for Sudan and Yemen. Yemen data are a bit older because, unfortunately, as some of you may know, WFP had to cease its operations in northern Yemen at the end of January due to the extreme conditions we have been operating in the last years that were not sustainable anymore. So our access also to collect data is a lot smaller now. I would like to spend a couple of words on fertilizers. I have seen that the previous panel actually talked a lot about it, so I would maybe repeat in part what was said. And I just wanted to make sure to make a point, because I don't want to diminish in any way the potential impact that the fertilizer crisis may have in the next, especially after the next harvest around the world. So in a roughly a 6-month span. But I want also to make a strong point on the fact that, especially for organizations like us working on emergencies, oil is as much as important as fertilizers for food security. I know that because we encountered many times with the media exchanges that fact that the people associate fertilizers to food and oil on the cost of heating and moving a car, but it's not like that. Oil is fundamental, especially in developing countries, for anything that is connected to food systems, for conservation, transportation, and production. So it has a lot faster transmission on food prices and food security than anything else, apart from food prices themselves. I said that on the first slide. I said that for now we are seeing something that we can say it's not unprecedented, in the sense that we have seen shocks like that unfolding also very recently in the region. There are some factors that make us think there is a higher probability than in the past that the current crisis may become something unprecedented if it's protracted, and especially, or even worse, if it's worsened in the next months. That for a simple fact. I mean, anybody here, and I mean, it's a Middle East institute, so many of you are familiar with the region. Over the last decade and a half, we have been used to a sort of informal institution in the region, whereby the strong countries usually come to support weaker countries in their moment of especially financial need. That was the case, for example, as I said before, in 2022. For Egypt, that was in part bailed out thanks to basically the Gulf monarchies' money, or also sometimes it's also international powers around the world that intervene. Also, the US is a big supporter, financial supporter of some of the countries in the region. The problem now that is unprecedented is that, as you all know, at this time, also the strong countries are not so isolated financially from this particular crisis, this particular conflict. And if another intervention, another more support of the size that was, for example, needed in 2022 is needed this time, it may be absolutely still possible, but politically more complicated for allied countries to intervene, especially in supporting the Tier 2 countries that may be in need in a few months if the crisis is protracted. So we are, for now, it's something we have seen before. We also see that in coming months there is still not so likely, but with a significantly probable scenario that would transform this crisis in something completely different potentially. I just wanted to close with a few indicators that we usually try to monitor, and we collected in the last years, looking at especially the countries in the region when they go through macroeconomic crisis that translate into food security potentially, and food insecurity. Sorry. We have seen, for example, because in the past we have seen that also colleagues or sometimes ourselves, we expect maybe a tipping point and a sudden breakdown, while what we have seen it's something that is a slow motion. and it's worth monitoring some signs. For example, when you start having financial controls, we start having procurement systems that cannot really pay in time their bills. So it's something we saw a lot in Egypt and Tunisia in 2022. A two-tier market whereby there is basically a black market emerging both for currency and for basic staples with different prices, where at least establishments and rich households can initially access. And a sharper tone basically on crackdowns for informal exchange rate, currency exchangers, staple black market, and so on and so forth. This is something that we recommend monitoring, in the sense that to not to be surprised if when actually the crisis start accelerating and things start unfolding a lot faster. These are usually early warning indicators that can emerge a lot earlier than the actual unfolding of the crisis. I will stop here, and thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. I want to come back to a couple of the things that you mentioned in your slides, but let me move on to you, Aaron. We have the macro picture. We've talked about sort of the affordability issue, the oil cost issue. You operate where the food system has essentially broken down. Could you describe a little bit how you're positioning yourself right now? What are your current sort of points of focus, and which communities are you most concerned about?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know World Central Kitchen, we're a humanitarian emergency feeding organization. So we feed all over the world. Right now, we're feeding in Gaza hundreds of thousands of meals every day. In Lebanon, about 25,000 meals a day. Ukraine, Haiti, Philippines, volcanic activity is having us active there as well. Northern Mariana Islands because of cyclones. So warfare, natural disasters. When we talk about downstream impacts of broken food systems, we're about as downstream as it gets, because we're cooking hot meals, we're giving them to people in need immediately. So let me talk a little bit about Gaza, because I think from the Middle Eastern perspective, that's certainly by far our biggest activation in the history of the organization. So we were recently doing as many as 1 million meals a day just in February and March in Gaza. And to do something of that complexity requires just a huge logistics pipeline. I learned the other day that to do 1 million meals in a day takes 5,000 pounds of salt. One day, 5,000 pounds of salt. That gives you some sense of the scale of the work. So dozens of trucks sourced from throughout the Middle East, but primarily sourced from Egypt. So we get about 95% of our food from Egypt, but also from Jordan, also from Israel, also from Cyprus, depending upon what's going on with border closures and frankly, food availability and prices. So far, following the Iran war, we saw a pretty quick bump up, about 30% increase in our prices for those food inputs. That's rice, that's lentils, that's spices, salt, vegetables, canned, fresh, frozen, meat. So there's that immediate impact. It stabilized a little bit now. So it went from about 25 to 30% increase. I think it's down a little bit now, 17 to 25 probably is the current range of what we're paying for food inputs relative to pre-war prices. It's also impacting the cost of logistics. Our trucking contracts tend to be a little bit longer term, but notwithstanding that, oil prices obviously are up. We've been talking about that. So that impacts the price that we're paying for trucking both into Gaza and then within Gaza once we get within Gaza. So you've got this very immediate impact in terms of the prices that we pay. That translates into fewer meals that we're able to cook because we just can't afford to pay the higher prices. So that has a dramatic impact on our ability to meet the need of the people on the ground. I'll talk about Lebanon for a moment, because obviously the war has a much more direct impact in Lebanon. The war is happening in Lebanon. Massive dislocation, lots of IDPs. Our kitchens have to move in response to those closures and the threats and where the population is going. So there's sort of this massive increase in need. But again, higher prices, we don't have the ability to meet all the needs. We're just meeting a small fraction of the needs. That's true in Gaza as well as Lebanon. There's also sort of this distraction that's happening in the humanitarian community because, and not just that, geopolitically, everyone's focused on the Strait of Hormuz, on the Iran war, and then everyone kind of forgets about Gaza because Gaza feels like an intractable problem. It's been there forever, and the current crisis has been going on for 2.5 years. So the peace process bogs down a little bit. The donor interest dries up a little bit. And in the meantime, people are as needy as they ever were. I mean, Gaza is unique in so many ways because it's a closed system. There's no economy in Gaza right now. There's no farms growing food in Gaza right now. There's no ability for people in Gaza to take care of themselves. They're entirely reliant on food coming in from outside. And where there's no food security, there really can't be peace, right? The only folks who benefit when there is food insecurity are the people with the guns. And so, the reality is that, from our perspective, we're very, very focused on food security as an element of national security. And we're often saying to anybody who will listen that when we talk about humanitarian aid, because recognize this is all happening in this climate of a general pullback in government humanitarian aid. So when we talk about humanitarian aid, people often think about that as just giving away resources to foreigners, right? But the truth is that food insecurity destabilizes the entire world, right? So when people don't have food, conflict arises, bad actors come into the scene. When people don't have food, migration increases, human need increases. All of this spills over into neighbors. All of this leads to global instability. So humanitarian aid ought not to be thought of as merely just helping people in need, which is worthy in its own right, obviously, but also as an investment in the security of America and America's allies. So we see the challenges everywhere. I guess the final thing that I would say is when these conflicts flare up, when Iran started, for example, Israel considered closing the border to Gaza once again. And they did dramatically reduce the inflows into Gaza. And when that happens, our supply chain is under immediate threat. We have 2 or 3 days at most of food at any given time in Gaza. And so when the borders close, it's not long until we're unable to cook any meals. So fortunately, in that situation, we were able to work with our own U.S. State Department to help convince Israel the importance of keeping those borders open to our trucks. But it was touch and go for a number of days. And so all of this is very complex. All of it requires lots of diplomacy, lots of help from the U.S. government, lots of conversation. And, in the meantime, those increasing prices are making our ability to feed people that much more difficult.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you for giving Gaza attention. It's the clearest and most acute example of food insecurity in the region, but it's the most difficult to talk about for all of the reasons that you've outlined. So I really appreciate that. Shalar, I want to come to you for sort of a more of a kind of a macro look. We've had in the region governments that are struggling between deteriorating macroeconomic picture and between people that were already reporting difficulty in accessing food. I think the Arab Barometer survey data came out even before the crisis, highlighting just how food insecure households in the region were feeling. And so give us a sense of what sort of room do these governments have to work with when it comes to handling the current crisis?
Oh, thank you. So I hope the mic is working.
It is working.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation and chance to talk. So I'm going to do, everybody, in case you don't know about the World Bank, we are the source of all the problems in the region and the solver of all the problems at the same time. So we take this role very seriously. We just got our spring meetings a couple of weeks ago, and right during those spring meetings, we issued our regional update, which comes every 6 months. So I highly recommend everybody to read it. because at the end of June is my annual evaluation. And the number of downloads directly impacts my annual evaluation by my VP. Joking aside, I took this job around a year ago. I spent 22 years in the research department of the bank, where I could sit 3 hours straight, work on a paper. Then 3 days on the presentation. It was fantastic life. And everything good comes to an end. They said you had enough, break. So they put me in this new job where every 3 hours there's a new crisis in the region, which is a challenge. It's making a part of my brain that never really worked. And it's a struggle. And I'm going to tell you from my personal angle and how it translates into Middle East. I grew up in Turkey. I actually, my family history, part of my family is from Tabriz, part of my family is from Aleppo, and part of them are from Kirkuk, right? And they all end up in the small town as the Ottoman Empire is collapsing near Ankara. And I had second cousins in all of these places. And as a kid, we would go visit them, right? But and then of course, like all Turks, you talk about politics every day. But my professional and personal lives were separate until a year ago. Now, the saying, every happy family is very sane, but every dysfunctional family is unhappy in their own unique ways. This is very true about every country in our region, and it's true about every crisis. Right? That's what I'm actually digging into the data and seeing it, and it is a very similar thing. Every crisis is different, though our minds try to find, the unique and same thing, so we can say the same thing and offer the same solution. So this crisis is different than Gaza, and it's different than the civil war in Syria, different than what happened in Libya, or what's happening in Yemen or Afghanistan. By the way, our region, they said you don't have enough troubles. It's a very peaceful, stable, and prosperous region. So we're going to add Afghanistan and Pakistan to you because, our VP was getting an easy ride, apparently. Here we are. Now, this one past year taught me 3 things, and I'll go there. This will give you I want to start with a kind of a bigger picture, what I'm observing in the region and how it relates to food insecurity. Number one is I was at a panel in January in the region. By the way, I was in Riyadh and Oman literally 3 days before the attacks started. And so there was a geographer in the panel, and then there's a demographer. So the demographer starts with demography is destiny. And the geographer said, no, geography is destiny. Now, I didn't realize until that moment geographers are like economists. They're very imperialistic. So everything falls under the geography umbrella. So they had this debate, and I'm really enjoying it. And the events, if you look at the history of the Middle East, and the history of the Middle East has a long arc, and we have a huge memory, because you talk about start talking about Middle East, we go back to the Crusaders, right? Because it's all linked to the Crusaders, right? But now the recent events, for example, are showing to me this specific, and it's about geography, right? But if you look at, for example, part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's about demography, or what happened in Syria, the ethnic conflicts, that's about demography, right? So each crisis has a different component. This one has a more geographic content, especially the food one. The second thing that's related to this is one of the things the bank and everybody else, we've been telling everybody in the region, 2 things have to happen, though these are slightly inconsistent advices, but we don't tell them at the same time, so people don't realize it. The first one is, you need to diversify, right? Especially we tell this to the GCC guys, you need to diversify from oil, you need to diversify from the assets and stuff. The current crisis is making us, first, they said they've been diversifying, but they haven't. Look at the impact. But the second thing, diversification is not just sectoral. Turns out there's a geographic diversification needed. Because as long as you produce urea, or you produce aluminum, or you produce cars, or you have the Amazon data center, it's at the mercy of the geography, right? It's at the mercy of the strait. So we have to rethink that geography and diversification. The other advice we give said, no, you have to do regional integration. Now, if you think about it, regional integration requires specialization. Specialization in economics is the opposite of diversification. right? But no, we tell people to specialize because there are economies of scale and there's lowering the cost. But what we are realizing, regional integration creates interdependence. And what happened in Europe, we don't want the Germans and the French to have another war. So we make them interdependent on each other. They specialize in different things. They trade and free mobility. So the war becomes too costly. This can apply within the country or between the countries. We've been saying that, but it also brings a cost because if a shock hits, you're at the mercy of the shock in the other country because this is where you're buying your stuff or this is where you're selling your stuff. Seems the Middle East, we have all the costs of the integration, right? Regional integration and none of the benefits, seems, right? So that's another big flaw that we have to rethink as the World Bank because we're going to solve all of these, don't worry about it, right? Now, the third thing is related to this is, so I'm talking to my VP, he's a brilliant man. I really love him as a boss. He's from Senegal and he's an engineer. I used to be an engineer, so we can talk before I sold my soul and became an economist. So he wants numbers, he wants data. So he's asking things, and coming from the research department, my immediate thing, I don't know. Because why do I have you around? Because in this day and age, you have immediate access to any bomb. You're following the bomb on a camera in real time, right? We have so much immediate data on everything. This is all we know everything immediately, and he wants the answers. And I'm trying to tell him there's a big difference between what the media does, but exploring the implications of that event and what it means for poverty, what it means for food insecurity, what it means for the inflation, long-term inflation in Egypt, or what it means for X, Y, and Z crop yields in Sudan. I do not know. You cannot know it because first, we do not collect the data on a real-time basis. Our poverty surveys are done at best every year. Lebanon did not do a census since 1927. I do not know. So one of the things we are doing now, which is both, I'm very proud of saying it, but at the same time, it comes as a huge caveat. Instead of the poverty number, for example, 1/5 of the Lebanese are displaced. 1/5. Imagine. That is around 65 million people in the United States displaced out of their homes. Imagine how many homes, the number varies, how many homes have been destroyed in Lebanon. I have no idea about the poverty impact of this. I will not know it at best for 2 more years. But my VP wants an answer tomorrow. So what proxy variables can I watch? Right? From a policy angle and an academic angle, that has been one of the benefits of this war for me is I need to come up with answers because you're going to ask for it. My VP is going to ask for it. Most importantly, the finance minister of Lebanon is going to ask for it. Right? So those are the 3 big picture. So I have learned, my grandfather was a fruit farmer back in Turkey. And we are an amazing consumers of fruits. And I thought I knew a lot about farming because of that. Turns out I didn't. Like everything else I'm learning on this job. And I learned way more than I thought I could about fertilizers and stuff. But, we're talking about fertilizers and guys are way more knowledgeable and experienced experts on this. But one thing, do we really know what is going to happen? Right? We don't know. I mean, the hard part, this is the message I'm trying to give my VP is we have to get comfortable with this uncertainty. We have to get comfortable with saying we do not have the precise thing. I'll end with one number. I had prepared a PowerPoint, but I decided I'll speak really fast. So we come up in our regional update, we come up with the growth numbers for each country, right? 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever the number is, that's not the point. We come up with a single number, but it is such a flawed approach because I have no idea what the band around it, in statistical terms, the confidence interval. So what I did is we took out all their, from the city banks of the world to the IMF to you name it, think tanks, they come up with growth numbers for each country. After the conflict, we collected all of them. And I just showed it for Saudi Arabia. Forget about Iraq or Sudan or Djibouti, because nobody follows those. But everybody follows Saudi Arabia. The growth number of Saudi Arabia before, on December 27, that's the last time we compiled it, the band, the lowest and the highest, was around 1.5%. Now it's close to 10%, right? Now, all these people who get paid 5 times more than I do, whose livelihood, the investment bankers who advise, right? If they cannot agree on this number, there's a huge difference whether if it's -8% or +2%. Imagine you're the finance minister and they ask you the growth rate and you give a 10% point interval, you're fired the next day, right? So this is, but we have to get comfortable because nobody knows. And that's the problem, because we are all experts and my VP expects me to know, and I'm trying to train him to that I do not have all the answers. So that.
Thanks, Shalar. So I want to drill down on a couple of
Yes.
details before I open it up to audience questions. Going back to you, Eugenio, you had mentioned in your penultimate slide the potential, sort of the potential emergence of kind of a two-tier system, right? Where those who can afford still have the ability to procure, and those who don't, kind of, are facing longer queues, less sort of more limited access to product. I'm curious, when you look at that from your experience, is that something that, could lead to a more immediate breakdown? Does it provide a little bit more room in terms of sort of how the situation is dealt with on the ground? Give us a sense of what you've seen in similar cases where that's happened.
Okay. It's a very good question, and sometimes, as colleague from the World Bank just said, many times there are things that happened before, but they don't have the same effect on the ground this time, and the other way around, things that never happen, you don't know, they're gonna have a big impact. I would say, but that's obviously my very personal opinion. I mean, the big elephant in the room, especially when you work with these with the countries that have been going through several shocks, didn't come out of them very well. They're exposed and they've been exposed in the past, in recent past, to political turmoil. The big if I think for many of these countries, whether they are or they are not in conflict or in political turmoil at the moment, like the tier 1 countries, okay. Even the tier 2 countries, the big if is whether instability kicks in as a response of the first signs of higher inflation, economic downturn due to the crisis, or other factors combined with the crisis, and so on and so forth. There is I mean, I've been a think tanker myself long before joining a humanitarian organization and working on the Middle East as well. Something we all know is that there is a sort of tradition in winter months in several countries, especially in North Africa, there are, when protests happen, big or small, they happen in winter months. If we have an impact now, I would see what happens later on, around November, December, January, in countries that are start being affected by the price increases and other impacts.
Thanks, Eugenio. I realize that was a tough question, so thanks for taking
No problem.
that. Erin, I want to see if maybe you can reflect a little bit on kind of what you've mentioned on sort of where the responses are falling shortest right now in some of these areas where you are engaged in, given kind of the cumulative challenges that you have, that you are facing. I'm curious, from your perspective, what would it take at sort of at the global level to meaningfully change, sort of kind of what we are seeing right now in terms of limited responses, in terms of some of those challenges over the next few months before the situation becomes irreversible, particularly in some of these, really challenging areas that you've highlighted?
Thank you. That's a big question because there's so many things that can help in terms of how we think long-term about how we should be setting up as a society, how we should be planning to address future needs. I'll tick off a few that come top of mind. One would be the way that we do humanitarian aid. The historic approach to this was sort of bringing in food from surpluses in the US or Europe. That's devastating for local economies in the places that are receiving that aid. It means that people aren't going to buy the rice from the local farmer because the rice is coming in from like Miami or something. We've had this problem in Haiti, for example. And so that has a sort of compounding effect of deepening the long-term misery of the people. And so in order to give people the best opportunity to be able to recover and be self-sustaining, we need to procure locally. We need to hire locally. And so we try to do that everywhere in the world that we can. And so when we leave a place, we're leaving a place hopefully in a way where farmers are better off and able to buy the things they need, the fertilizer. We talked a lot about fertilizer today. Able to buy the seeds they need, able to have a market to be able to sell into for the crops they're going to be able to grow in the next year. So that's one example, just the way that we do relief. We want it to be local, want it to be community-led. Another way that we think about preparing is in the kinds of aid that we give specifically. So most of what we do is giving people hot meals in times of immediate crisis. But what about a long-term crisis? Ukraine now, 4+ years. You've got families who've been living just next to the front lines for a long time, and it's very hard, very dangerous to get them a hot plate of food. Just yesterday, one of our vehicles in Ukraine was targeted by a Russian drone. And luckily nobody was killed, but the vehicle is no longer usable. And so that makes our mission that much more difficult. So how do we make sure that people close to the front lines have food that they need? How can they be self-sustaining in this environment? Seeds, giving people seeds, they can plant gardens, they can harvest food. Egg-laying hens. People in Ukraine sometimes call us world central chicken because they've gotten used to this idea of us giving them hens. They can harvest eggs every day and feed their families, a constant source of protein. So that's one way. Diversifying supply chains is critical. So we look at a place like Gaza, and the border to Gaza could close at any point for political reasons. Okay, well, how can we get food into Gaza if we're not going from Egypt through Kerem Shalom? We can ship it from Cyprus. We can get it from Europe or Egypt by ship. You've got to plan that far in advance. It takes a lot longer to go by ship than it does by truck. And there are risks that get introduced into the system. And different costs. So all of those become factors. I mean, Gaza is unique in a lot of ways. I know you asked about on the global scale, but a lot of the things that we do elsewhere in the world just can't work in Gaza because it's a closed system. So it's a particularly challenging environment. But like the bigger picture, I think the takeaway point, I guess, in response to your question, from my perspective, is really trying to do aid in a way that gives people the best chance at being self-sustaining in the long run, so that when the war happens, they're not left destitute. I'll give an example that maybe will drive the point home a little bit. About a third of the food that's grown in the world never makes it to market. And the main reason is because the food spoils. Fruit spoils, doesn't have a long shelf life. In a place like Haiti, for example, we do a lot of work, and we've historically done a lot of work. How can we help the people to be able to get more food to market, to feed more people, to drive prices down? Cold storage, right? Investing in refrigerated trucks, for example. Investing in technology that will allow farmers to dehydrate their food so it has a longer shelf life. Things like this, and this is, kind of tangential to our mission. Other NGOs work on these kinds of things. but helping local farmers when they are producing to be able to get food to market more reliably, and then making sure that a market exists for them. So school food programs, making sure there's a stable kind of farm to school pipeline so that farmers have a place to put their food immediately, and that's paid for either by NGOs or by local governments who may have the capacity to do that. I mean, there are policy issues, there are very practical issues, and there are sort of issues with the way that we do humanitarian relief, all of which can feed into longer term sustainability and more benefits and less shock to people when disruption happens.
Great, thanks so much, Aaron. That's fantastic. Shalar, I want you to zoom out even further than when I asked you in my last question, and looking kind of at the longer arc, especially in this region, North Africa, Middle East. There's been, many food shocks before that we have seen, 2008, 2011, 22. Governor Beasley mentioned this. I want you to touch on a couple of things. One, which you already sort of spoken about just very briefly in your first set of remarks, which is, what do you see as really sort of meaningfully different in this crisis? And the second thing is, what structurally has to change so that the region can handle the next food crisis that's, sure to come, however many years from now? What do you think structurally needs to change so that these governments' ability to handle that is a little bit better?
I don't know. No, look, food crisis is one aspect of it. Because what is the phrase? Is it ignoring the important at the expense of the urgent, right? Food issue is an emergency issue because we are seeing, children, and we are seeing elderly, and everybody's suffering. But to me, and looking at, again, the long arc of history in the Middle East, this is the side effect of all the underlying structural problems in the region, right? And all these things, logistics, number one, supply chain management issues, or everything, you name it, the water fights, right? I mean, that's a fun, pretty much every big river in the region crosses a national border. All of these contribute to this. We remember the food issue, or we remember these, or nobody talked about fertilizers in the region up until this crisis, until an emergency happens. Now, I had a great graph there. You look at the oil prices in the world, and how it skyrocketed, and especially we focus on the futures markets, not just the spot market. And you see it and how it's volatile. Global oil market is an integrated market, right? If the oil price in Japan changes, it changes also in Zambia, and it changes more or less. They're highly correlated. That's not the case with natural gas because they're segmented markets. Nothing happened to the natural gas prices in the United States. Pretty much stayed flat, right? And you see what happened in Europe because they are reliant on much more on the Middle East. Same thing with the food prices. If you look at the food prices, what is being traded and what is not. Again, it takes us back to the debate between diversification and specialization. But all of it, the gains from specialization and the gains from integration arise when you have political peace. I mean, you cannot just focus on the food issue because the next crisis, who knows what's going to be about? I have no clue because every crisis is different. But the one thing that's connecting all of them is the political tension and the political conflict. And it is not easy to solve those, right? Every civil war, everyone has a different reason. The commonality is that they're all in the geography, and my Egyptian wife says it's the Turks' fault. And so as a Turk working in the World Bank, I'm doubly guilty because pretty much everything happens within 300 or 400 miles of Turkish borders, apparently. So we are the center and the heart. But solving the food problem, I cannot see how it can be solved. I mean, no offense to World Kitchen. You cannot be there for every crisis. Right. No. It's impossible. It's costly and it's humanly impossible. You can't be the solution. Right. Peace has to come. I do not know how else to put it. It's easier to say than done, looking at the history of the region, but there is no other solution. And what the one silver lining of this crisis in the political sense, this is not World Bank sanctioned comment, by the way, is that the rich guys and the poor guys are on the same boat for the first time. That they're realizing they all depend at the mercy of their geography. So I'm hoping maybe that'll be a reason for peace in the region, realizing that they're on the same boat. But otherwise, next one, who knows what will it crisis. The second solution that we need, there's a unique aspect of the Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that's our new name, as I said, is that we have the world's lowest female labor force participation rate, right? Now, ironically, all of these countries have significantly high education level of women. Actually, whether if it's Saudi Arabia or Iran, majority of the university students are women. As I joked in our previous report on the female labor force chain, I wanted to put the title, Educating Our Daughters, but Keeping Our Wives at Home, right?
A great title.
I'm sorry.
No, that was the response of my boss. So it didn't happen. But that is the pattern we are seeing, right? Imagine I'm not just the economic loss, forget it, right? But the participation of women in all aspects of life changes the dynamics significantly. We have seen it in other countries. It's just not happening in the Middle East. Now, it's an endogenous thing. It's not just the culture and norms. Everything is reinforcing each other. It's the economics. So, but if you want to change the Middle East, you have to give women more economic voice. There's no other way. They already have the qualifications. Let's figure it out. I think that's the way to solve, and all of these things, whether if it is the supply chains, the poverty, the agriculture, the food, I mean, we're talking about Egypt. The big problem in Egypt in the last 2 months, the currency depreciated close to 14%, right? We pumped in, I mean, we had these really remarkable projects in Egypt, IMF, the bank, and the EBRD, to stabilize the currency and get rid of the dual exchange rate system. There's a black market rate and the official market rate, creating huge distortions. Right, we are about to implement it, solve the problem, the crisis comes, and now the currency skyrockets. And I don't know how much more it's gonna cost. If Egypt had a simple analysis, back of the envelope, you can show if the Egyptian female labor force participation was at the same level of countries around the world of the same income level. I'm not talking about Luxembourg or Singapore. If it was the same level in, let's say, Indonesia or in Thailand, similar income levels, Egyptian GDP today would be around 30% higher. When your GDP grows 30% overnight, you solve all your problems, right? So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks, Shalar. What we kind of keep coming back to is that this question of food insecurity is not just a geopolitical one. It's not just a political one. It's not a humanitarian one. It's fundamentally a governance issue as well.
All of it are interrelated.
Exactly.
Reinforcing each other.
The populations that are most vulnerable, this is something that Governor Beasley mentioned, Aaron, you as well, are the ones that are, the ones that are most vulnerable. Those are the ones that are most likely to lose faith in their governments. They're the ones most likely to migrate. They're the ones most likely to be drawn into instability. And that's ultimately the stakes of what we are talking about. So let me open it up for a few questions that if there are any in the room before wrapping up, please.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. My name is Tonya Atiyeh, and I am an incoming PhD student at American University. And I really love that we touched on Lebanon a lot. I'm from southern Lebanon. And there's recent reports, and obviously, we don't have all the answers. This conflict is constantly ongoing. But as negotiations are happening and we slowly start to think of the day after, right now, 95% of farmers in southern Lebanon are displaced. I believe it's 22 million square meters of land has been affected. Hundreds of thousands of trees and livestock have been destroyed and are essentially unusable. And I believe it's about 80% of Lebanon's local GDP, or of the South's local GDP, focuses on agriculture. So I think, as negotiations are happening and we think of the reconstruction that never happened back in 2024 and think of what the future should look like, what recommendations do you have for, policymakers, people who are in those rooms who are talking about or making decisions related to Southern Lebanon?
Thank you. Eugenio, maybe I can start with you and then we'll go around the room and see if anybody has any specific thoughts on this.
Okay, well, short answer is I really don't know, especially in the case of Lebanon. I'm not an expert on agricultural development. Again, we work really much on emergencies and long-term stuff is more my colleague's job. Yeah, no, I mean, I lived in Lebanon for a while, and if I again have a very personal impression, and you know that better than me since you're from there. Many times, yeah, it's not so much in the hands of Lebanon itself, due to the factors we actually talked about. My colleague just talked about geography mainly, in the case of Lebanon, being in a neighborhood where you are given only so much chance to really decide of on your own, on your destiny. So yeah, I think I know it's not very it might be depressing as an answer, but I was talking actually with a colleague about that informally a couple of days ago, exactly about this on Lebanon. He's Lebanese as well. And yeah, the impression is that Lebanon, especially in the last 1-2 years, did everything, I did not right 100%, but I mean, did significant steps ahead, and we are here again, no? For reasons that don't have anything to do with anything that was decided in Lebanon. So sorry for the depressing answer, but it's the only one that honestly comes to my mind.
Thanks, Eugenio. Shelar, do you want to take it or shall we take another question? Aaron, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer, so this is. I feel like it's dangerous, but I'll try to draw an analogy to what we do as World Central Kitchen when we're leaving a place where the restaurant ecosystem has been damaged by a natural disaster. We often give grants to businesses that have been destroyed so they can rebuild their business. The problem with the farmer isn't dissimilar, right? The tractors are destroyed, right? The other resources a farmer needs to regrow and replant the land just aren't there. It takes capital to restart a business. That's what you need. So if you want to see a return quickly to the pre-war economy, farmers back on the soil, farmers back growing food, then those farmers need capital to help them to do that. So I don't know who the provider of that capital is. I don't know where that investment comes from, but I'll just, we can draw parallels to post World War II Europe and the need to rebuild there, and how U.S. expenditures there obviously redounded to the benefit of the entire world, and including the United States. So it seems to me that the world community has a responsibility, including the neighbors to Lebanon, to help farmers get back on their feet, to help that economy get going again. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer or not.
That's a great answer, Shelar. Are you providing capital?
So if you look at Lebanon, it really truly is the microcosm of the Middle East, right? In a 300 by 50, 60 mile rectangle. Every problem in the Middle East is in a magnified and a smaller scale. You see it in Lebanon, right? And all the good things too, by the way. You have all 4 seasons in such a small land, right? Fertile land, great trade routes, great port cities. These were historically the business and the multi-ethnic and prosperous cities of the Middle East. They were there. At the same time, you have the ethnic conflict, the diversity, you name it, which can be an asset or a liability, you name it, it's there. So it is, if there's the political will, global political will to fix the Middle East, you have to fix Lebanon. When I joined the bank, we had this legendary VP, Gobin Nankani. He came to our orientation. He said, look, you can do all the analysis in the world. You can do all the, collect all the data, write the best reports for Argentina to implement a reform. None of it is going to work. You want them to do the right thing, you tell them the Chileans are doing it. Right? It's the same thing. We fix Lebanon, we fix the Middle East, literally, because every other country, it becomes a success story. But how do you fix Lebanon? The biggest asset of Lebanon are its people, the diaspora. Right? Think of all the famous Lebanese, you know, around the world. Right? There are more Lebanese outside than in Lebanon, including in South America, you know, including Carlos Slim or Carlos Menem, to famous singers and you name it, soccer players. The diaspora, and there's incredible attachment to the land. We have to start there. Because you have to unify the people and you have to start unifying the diaspora. In many cases, let's say in the case of Ethiopia, it's the diaspora that's fighting each other. Here, I'm hoping the silver lining of this war is also maybe bring the Lebanese together, regardless of your ethnic, religious, whatever background, or you live in Argentina, or you live in Nigeria, or you live in Paris. This is it. This is your chance, right? Again, it will start with the political will, because the money is there and the expertise is there. No other country in the Middle East has that luxury. Then you go to the next step. You don't need the World Bank money. The Lebanese have the money.
Thanks, Charles. I hope Carlos Slim is listening. In the meantime, let me see if there are any other questions in the room before we wrap it up. Any other questions? So let me thank you all so much for joining us today. I want to particularly thank my co-panelists, Aaron Shalar, Eugenio. I will also thank Governor Beasley for setting the tone for this conversation and our colleagues in the first panel. And thank you all so much for taking the time on this Friday morning to join us. And last but not least, I also would like to thank our events team for pulling this together. So please join me in thanking. And also please be sure to continue to check out Middle East Institute's ongoing work on this issue. We've got a number of resources on our website, articles, policy memos. So please be sure to keep checking in. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.